take me out in the deep waters, and there's that beautiful picture that the Lord gave Ezekiel and took him out into that marvelous river of life where he had no more control. And only the head showed, and that's all it needs to show, because the head is Jesus Christ. And then when he came out of the river, he ended up in paradise. He came out of the river in paradise. So you can't lose by letting go. But aren't we blessed to have such a shepherd as Pastor Chuck? So let's just welcome him. I'm the blessed one to have sheep like you. The children of Israel, it seems, were constantly failing the purposes of God. There would be times of spiritual revival, but they would soon revert back to their practices of worshiping the other gods. And God would bring them into a place of distress, hardship, bondage. They'd cry unto God, and God would hear and answer, and God would deliver them. And for a while they would serve God, and then it would be back, and it was a repeated pattern over and over. I think that it is important to note the gods that they were worshiping. They were worshiping Molech, who was the god of pleasure. They were worshiping Mammon, who was the god of material possessions, power. They were worshiping Ashtoreth, who was the goddess of sex. They were worshiping Baal, who was the god of the intellect. As we look at our nation today, what are the things that are captivating the minds and hearts of the people? Pleasure, power, material possessions, sex. So in reality, we find that we are pretty much as guilty as were they of spiritual adultery. They were constantly falling away from God's best for their lives. Constantly going back again into bondage because these things were mastering them. They were guilty of not being a separate people. God said that He wanted them to be a separate people, that they weren't to really intermarry with the people of the nations round about, because that's where this idolatry and all came in. Even Solomon, with all of his wisdom, in disobeying the commandment of the scriptures, multiplied unto himself wives, and in the end, the wives did exactly what God said that the wives would do if a king would multiply wives. They would turn the heart of the king from the Lord. And at the end of Solomon, we find him into idolatry as he was building temples and altars for the various wives who came from the different countries round about in an endeavor to please them. So intermarriage was a big problem, because that led to the worship of the different gods of the nations that surrounded them. Ultimately,
God allowed them to go into captivity. Ultimately, they were conquered by the Babylonian army, 606. And they carried away hostages. There was a rebellion. The Babylonian army came back again and again until Jerusalem was destroyed, burned with fire, and the people were taken away captive. The children of Israel had failed in obeying the law of God concerning the Sabbath rest for the land. Every 7 years, they were to allow the land to go fallow. They were to not pick the fruit. They were to leave it for the poor people and for the animals. And they were to just give the ground rest every 7 years. From the time of the reign of Saul unto 606 BC was 490 years. And so God said, well, because you have not given the land the Sabbath rest, the land has 70 years of rest coming to it. And so you will be captive unto the enemies for 70 years in order that the land might have its Sabbaths. The 70 years are now expired. And the decree goes forth in 457. Beg your pardon, in the year let me get it for you here. I'll have it exactly, 36 BC. The decree went forth from Cyrus for the rebuilding of the temple. And those that wanted to return were given the privilege of returning. As Cyrus was fulfilling the prophecies in Isaiah 45, 44, where God calls him by name, says, "You're my prince," and you will allow the people to return from their captivity. And led by Zerubbabel and Joshua, they came back and they began to rebuild the temple. Haggai the prophet was there to encourage them on, to urge them on in the rebuilding project. And so they rebuilt the temple. Now, some 79 years later, in 436, senior moments, you'll experience them one of these days. In 457 BC, under a decree by Artaxerxes Longimanus, Ezra was sent back to set up a provisional government and to sort of reestablish the temple worship. Over the 79-year period that the temple was rebuilt, they had sort of just again neglected the temple worship. And so Ezra was sent back to rebuild the worship and to establish the provisional government. Now, as Ezra came back, we read in the 9th chapter and the 3rd verse of Ezra that, verse 2, that he heard that they had taken of the daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have been mingled with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and the rulers have been chief in this trespass. They were doing the very same things that caused the captivity so many years earlier. They had gone right back to to these same practices that led to idolatry, that caused them to lose the land that God had given to them. And when Ezra heard this, we read that in verse 3, I rent or tore my garment and my mantle. I plucked off the hair of my head and my beard, and I sat down astonished, or in astonishment. And he sat there all day long, just stunned that the people would go back to the very things that caused them to lose the land in the first place. I mean, he was just astonished at this, and tears his clothes, plucks out his hair, and sits there astonished. Now, Ezra was a man of different cloth than Nehemiah. 12 years later, in 445 BC, as Nehemiah met some fellows that had returned from Jerusalem, and he began to question them, how are things going in the holy city? How is it to be in Jerusalem? And they said, oh, hey, it's terrible. The walls are still broken down. We have no defenses. The enemy comes in and raids us during the night, and everybody is just absolutely discouraged. The morale is just at the bottom. And Nehemiah was so disturbed over this report of Jerusalem that he began to fast and he began to pray. And weeping, came his turn to take the cup to the king, because he was the king's cupbearer. And it was the same Artaxerxes, Longimanus. And as he came into the king, he said, what's wrong? You look, I've never seen you look sad like this before. You're not sick. It must be sorrow of heart. Nehemiah said, how could I be happy when the city of my God is lying waste? The king said, well, what would you like me to do? And one of those arrow prayers, I prayed unto the God of heaven, and I said to the king, I would like permission to go back and to rebuild the walls of the city. So in the first of Nisan, in the year 445 BC, Nehemiah received the decree to go back and to restore and to rebuild the city. Now this is 12 years after Ezra had gone back with about 2,000 people to reestablish the worship of God. And when Nehemiah came to the city, he found the same thing was going on, this intermarriage. And we read in Nehemiah 13, in those days, verse 23, I saw the Jews that had married wives from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab, and the children spake half in the speech of Ashdod. They could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. I contended with them, I cursed them, I smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters. He's a different sort than Ezra. Ezra pulled out his own hair, his own beard. But Nehemiah went after these fellows, pulled out their hair, and made them swear that they were going to get rid of these wives. But the thing that I note is that these men were passionate for the things of God. I think that one of our problems today is the fact that we don't have that kind of passion for righteousness. These were men that were passionate for righteous living.